Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome to my channel. If you've been here before, you'll know that I enjoy making one-layer scene cards, primarily with my Copic markers. Today I'm going to be using the Cookie Time stamp set by Waffle, and I'm starting off with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and this is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I'm just starting with my T-square ruler and a light pencil line to kind of map out where my placement will be for my stamping. My plan is to create kind of like a counter with cabinets where some of my little characters are standing behind, and also going to have a floor there too. So once I have those two lines drawn out, I'm going to go ahead and stamp my images out, and I'm using blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is Copic safe and gives a great crisp image. I'm not doing any masking here at all. It doesn't really require it. You can certainly do ink blending in the background rather than doing all Copics. In that case, you would definitely need to mask out your images. Some of my little characters are going to be standing in front of the cabinets on the floor there, which will be underneath that bottom line that I drew with my pencil. Once I had all of my images stamped out, I'm going to go ahead and finish out my scene there with my pencil first. And I won't show you all of this because I know it's very hard to see, but I'm using my T-square ruler again to map out everything. First, I'm fixing up some of these areas that didn't really stamp too well with an EK Success journaling pen. Then I'll move on to my pencil and my ruler. I am not artistic. I've said it before. Everything I do primarily is with straight lines. There are tons of tutorials out there. Sandy Allnack has great coloring classes that will kind of teach you how to create scenes, and it doesn't require a ruler. So I definitely recommend that you check some of those out. Next, I'm going to go in with my EK Success journaling pen and go over all of my pencil lines. I decided to use a little bit thicker of one. Now these come, I think, 5 or 6 to a pack with all different size tips. So I ended up using, this is the second to smallest one. And I'm just going to go ahead and use my ruler again and go over all of those lines that I had drawn in with my pencil. This is going to be my little cabinets here, and I have my countertop there on the top. I am trying to be careful not to go over my images. This is where masking may also come into play. If you feel a little insecure about, not going over your images, you can certainly mask those out. For my little floor there, I'm kind of doing like a hardwood floor, but the lines within the hardwood floor would appear closer together the further back they are. So you'll see that these are not spaced out evenly. The ones further back are closer together, and here I'm just drawing in random lines to make it look like the boards within the floor. And once all of my lines were down, I did take my eraser and took away any pencil lines that may have been showing through. Once you go over any pencil lines with your Copic markers or a lot of other different mediums, you're not going to be able to erase it later. So just make sure that you remember to erase those pencil lines before you start your coloring. I also took my T-square ruler just to draw little dots evenly across those cabinets. This will be where my little handles or knobs are later on. So I'm just going to color directly over them for now. Now I have this sped up quite a bit. I'm going to start with my cabinets here, and I'm starting off with my lightest color, which is a C1, and just adding my shading to the right of each of the cabinets and the spaces between the cabinets, as well as off to the left-hand side of my little characters or little kids there, or elves, I'm not sure what they're supposed to be, and also created a shadow underneath the cabinet. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color. This is the C5, and I'm going over all of those same areas where I created those shadows. I'm going in with just the tip of my marker in those little areas between the cabinets. I made these pretty tiny spaces, so you just want to make sure that you are allowing yourself room to blend that out with another C marker. For the cabinets themselves, I am doing small little flick lines just to make these areas a little bit easier to blend, being these are larger areas. Next, I'll go in with my C3 and blend all of those areas out. I'm also drawing little squiggly lines very lightly with just the tip of my marker all over the cabinets. This will appear that they are wood grain. Now, most of this will be covered up, and it is such a light color that it won't be all that noticeable, but it will give the cabinets just a little bit of texture. I'm just extending that C5 out in all of these areas, including the cabinets themselves, just extending those flicks out a little bit further. Now you'll see that I'm leaving a very large highlight color here because I want these cabinets to appear white. So I'm pretty much only adding my shadows and shading here. Most of the cabinets will remain white with just that wood grain look. Next, I'm going in with my C1 and extending everything out a little bit further. And you'll see that I'm extending those flicks out pretty far, maybe about halfway down the cabinet door themselves, or a little bit less than halfway. But I'm extending all of the shadows around those little kids down there on the bottom as well. Next, I'll take my colorless blender and I'm going to go in with the opposite direction and flick my way out, just to get rid of some of those flick lines that the C1 created. So it's a more smoother transition from the C1 to the white itself. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the floor. And I'm gonna do this very similar to the way I did the cabinets. I'm starting off by covering my entire area with my E50, which is the lightest color, just to get my paper saturated a little bit. It helps the blending. For my E37, I just added a little bit of shadow underneath my little kids down there. And for my E33, again, I'm going to add that little wood grain look to each of the little boards within the floor. Extended those shadows out underneath my little characters. Then going in with my E31 and extended those even further. I wasn't getting enough dimension, so I did add a little bit of shading where the cabinets meet the floor with that E33, blended it out with my E31, and then went back to my E50. I do have the E30, which is very similar to the E50, but it's pretty dry, so the E50 was a good match for that. I took my colorless blender just to take off some of those areas that I was kind of a little messy with my coloring, and kind of went over my little kids and their shoes or slippers or whatever they are before I went on to my coloring. For the wall behind my characters up on top there, I'm going to switch over to my warm gray markers. I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, which is the W5, and just do small little flick lines right there behind the cabinet. Move on to my W3, extend those flicks out even further. Now this wall would be further away from my little characters, so they wouldn't necessarily cast a shadow on the wall. This is kind of just like the backdrop. I'm not creating any shadows around them at all. Next, I'll move on to my W1 marker, and I'm covering up pretty much the entire thing. This is such a light color that if you accidentally go over some of the areas within your characters or within my little gingerbread house there, it's okay. You'll easily be able to cover them up. You'll see my little banners on top. I colored right over them. Like I said, it's such a light color that I wasn't really worried about covering that up later. Next, we'll move on to the coloring of these little characters, and I'm starting off with the skin tones first, and I'm going to do 2 of each. I'm only doing 3 color blends. These are really tiny areas. So I'm starting off with my E04 as being my darkest color, just putting my shading underneath their little hair, off to the sides of their feet and arms, blending that out with my E11, and then I'll move on to my lightest color, which is the E00, and just covering up that entire area. Next, I'll move on to my next 2 little characters here, concentrating my darkest areas pretty much being the same for each one. For this little girl or little boy in the middle, the darkest areas will be off to the right of his face, just because he's kind of bent backwards a little bit. Just using a little bit different of a color combination here. And then I will move on to my last 2 little kids here, and I'm going to color them with a little bit darker of a complexion. Again, starting with my lightest color and mapping out my darkest areas, again, underneath their hair and on the bottoms of their arms. going in with my darkest color and just darkening those areas up a little bit. You want to make sure that you're not putting too much dark color in any of the areas. The dark is just to give it contrast. So you'll just want to make sure that you're barely touching the paper with just the tip of your marker, blending that out with my E15. Then I'll go to my E11, and I wasn't getting a good blend, so I ended up taking out my E13, and that blended out much better. Next, we'll move on to their hair, and I will start with my brown hair first. And I'm going to start with we'll call it the mom in the center there. And I'm starting off with my darkest color here, which is the E59, just doing small little flicks with just the tip of my marker, leaving that highlight right there in the center of her hair, blending that out with the E57, and then going in with the E55. Be careful not to overblend. If you want to see those flicks in the hair, you want to make sure that you quickly go over with your lightest color and not overblend, or else you're going to lose those flicks. For these little kids, there's really not much hair showing, so I'm just doing a little bit of shading underneath their little hats. Some of the little girls have hair hanging below their shoulders, just putting a little bit of shading behind there. Different color combination here. This is more of a blonde color. Then I'll move on to the next two, which will have black hair. And I'm starting right with my black marker, just adding my darkest areas. For this little boy or little girl on top, I'm going to give them curly hair. So I'm just doing little squiggly lines, blending that out with the C7, and then finally blending it out with the C5. Next, I'll move on to the coloring of their little clothes and outfits. And I'm just going to basically show you the color combinations and how I colored the objects. I'm not going to show you all of the coloring. For my greens, I started off with my G03, moved on to the G20, the G28, and then the G07, and then back to the G03, just leaving the highlight there off to the right. For this little boy's hat, the shading would be down towards the bottom because, like I said, he's kind of bent backwards a little bit. So the darkest area would be on the bottom of his hat, but using the same color combinations pretty much throughout the entire card, just kind of switching up. Some will have green hats, some will have red hats, some will have like a golden yellow hat. Next, we'll move on to the reds, and I'm starting off with my R43, laying out my darkest areas. For the hats will pretty much be in the same areas for all of my little characters. Moving on to the dark red color, this is the E59, and just putting a very small line. Moving on to the R46, extending that dark color out a little bit, and then finally moving back in with my R43 and blending that all out. Once my red was done, we'll move on to kind of like a golden yellow color. Again, starting with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas first, getting that paper saturated. For this little apron here, I put a shadow underneath her little pocket there and under her arm. Moving on to the darkest color, adding that darkest area in and where your shadows will be, extending that out with my mid-tone color. Again, I'm using mostly flicking here. It just makes the blending a little bit easier. And then moving back in with the lightest color and blending all of that out. Once all of the clothing and everything was colored for all of my characters, I'm going to go ahead and color all of the other things, I guess. For this little rolling pin, I'm using my E50 markers. My darkest area on here will be on the bottom and where he's kind of holding on to it, I guess, and blending that out with my E57 and moving on to my E55 and blending the rest of that out. Now for this middle little girl or little boy, she's holding a pan, looking like she's run into the oven. I didn't want this to blend too much in with my cabinets, so I'm using my C7 and my C5 just to make this a little bit darker than the cabinets behind it so it doesn't blend in too much. For this little whisk, I wanted to bring in a little bit of a different color instead of just sticking to the red and green. So I'm going to go in with my blues here, Just putting a little bit of shading underneath her little hands, blending that out with my B14 and then finally my B12. I'm also going to color this little bowl the same way. My highlight for this one will be right in the center. Whenever there's a round object, you want to make sure that your highlight is in the center to make it appear round. I'm going to color the inside of the bowl the same way, leaving that highlight right there in the center, but I'm going to bring out my C markers to make it look like it's white or a light gray in the inside of that bowl. Next, we'll move on to this little gingerbread house off here to the left. And I'm going to start by coloring in solid with my E55, the house itself. I'm sorry, my E53. Just the house itself, leaving the little candies and things like that for a different color later on. I ended up adding a little bit of shading with the E57 underneath the roof and around the little door. It was just looking a little bit too flat for me. And I'll go in with my lightest color again and blend that out just a little bit. For the little stripes there on the bottom, I'm just going to color these in solid. These are teeny tiny little areas. You don't necessarily need to do shading on every single object. For things like this, something that's so small, you can get away with just using one solid color here. Next, I took my R20 marker and just added a little bit of color to all of their cheeks and where their mouths are kind of open a little bit. This one little girl off to the right on the top, she has her little tongue sticking out, so I went in with my R43 for that. And next we'll color the little banner that is hanging behind them. And I'm going to do my same three colors here. First, I'm going to kind of map out which ones are which, starting off with my R43, and I'm only doing 2 color blends on these little banners. My R46 will be my darkest color, blending that back out with my R43. For my greens, I'm using my G07. For my darkest color, I'm using the G28 and just adding a little bit of shading off there to the left, blending that back out with the G07. For my yellows, I'm using my Y23 and my YR24, doing the same shading off there to the left again. Once all of my coloring was done, I realized I forgot the countertop. So I wanted to make this look black, so again, it didn't blend in with my wall or my cabinets. So I'm starting off with my W7 and just putting some color there on either side. Then I'll go in with my black marker and just add a little bit more shading on either side. Blend that back out with my W7. Blend it out a little bit further with my W5 and just leaving a very small highlight there in the center. Next, we'll go in with the white gel pen and add some details to different areas. I'm adding some polka dots to some of their hats and their little outfits. I'll add some stripes here and there, and I'll also add some reflections on their hats and their outfits and their little aprons. When I add the reflections, I'm not necessarily worried about a light source. I kind of just put that wherever just to give it a little bit more dimension. Once all of my details were completed, we'll move on to the sentiment. Now I played around with the placement on here and I wish I would have stamped this off to the right, but I ended up stamping it off to the left. Not only did I stamp it off to the left, but I stamped it incredibly crooked. My plan was to color in the letters. They have kind of open spaces, but that wasn't going to work out because I stamped it very crooked. But we'll fix that later. First, I did cut down my panel just a little bit there on the top. You can see my little banners didn't necessarily reach the top of my card panel. So I just cut off just a little bit to the top and a little bit off there to the right to make it evenly spaced when I adhere this to a card base. Next, I took my Glossy Accents, and I have this in one of those fine tip, precision tip, or whatever they're called, bottles. And I'm just going to add this to my little banner here. And I'll also add just a little drop on the little pieces of candy, those red candies that we added to the little gingerbread house. Now this will take a little bit of time to dry, so make sure that you put this aside and you don't really touch your card for a little bit, or you're going to end up smearing your glossy accents. I went ahead and put my card panel aside to dry for a little bit. And in order to fix that crooked sentiment there, I'm taking a scrap piece of black cardstock here, treating this with my anti-static tool and stamping my sentiment with Versamark ink. And I'll use white embossing powder and go ahead and heat set this. I will end up cutting this into a strip and popping this up onto my card panel. I also took a shimmer pen by Nuvo and added a little bit of shimmer here and there to their clothes and their hats, as well as the snow on top of my little gingerbread house there. Once I had my sentiment popped up with my Scotch foam tape, I added black Nuvo drops to those little dots that we created for the knobs of the cabinets and adhered this to an A2 size card base, and that is it for today's card. Don't forget to leave a comment below, guys. I'm giving away a new cookie timestamp set by Waffle Flour. All of the information as well as all of the products used will be in the description below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.